Okay, so this is reading 1 through 3 intense review class. This is kind of a new concept. 1 through 3, reading 1 through 3 are classes that definitely, if you're taking this class right now, you have taken them. You've studied those fairly intensively over the last little while. And those are the ones that are passage-based. So this class leaves out 4 and 5, which are the classes where we're talking about graphs and charts and little tiny memos and those types of sources, and we're sticking to pretty much just passages and maybe occasionally something that's 1 or 2 paragraphs long, but mostly those bigger, longer passages that have come to be what most of you dread on the test itself. So this will be hopefully a really streamlined experience because now you've learned your critical reading strategy from reading 1. You've learned about identifying the best main idea, your best details, your best topics. You've learned about themes and tones. You've learned about purpose and passage style, which is from reading 2. And you've learned about logical conclusion and summary. So the idea behind this class is to kind of focus in to all of that and get kind of a streamlined version of that going now that you've done the really intense lecture over those where we really talked about what these things are and we really dove into how to find these answers and what to look for and how to recognize it. Now we want to look at making sure that you've really mastered the big, broad strategy. You really know what the steps are, and you really have a streamlined process for figuring out what that best final answer is. A couple of notes right up front. One thing that I get asked about all the time, and I say it all the time, but I still get asked about it. The critical reading strategy that I teach in reading 1 is essentially non-negotiable. Of course, you can do absolutely whatever you want to and not do absolutely whatever you don't want to. But in terms of being in a position where I would feel you are safe to keep the points that are being put in front of you on the test, critical strategy is not one of the things that I could say, oh, yeah, that works great for some people and it doesn't work great for others. You need your critical strategy and you need it to be absolutely mastered. And that's the key. So I get a lot of pushback with critical strategy, just as a reiteration, just in case you're sitting there wondering what I'm talking about. That's where we read the intro paragraph, we identify the topic and the main idea, and then we do the focus for each of the paragraphs thereafter, and we sort of build the passage as we go. So that I get a lot of pushback on that. And I get a lot of questions of it's taking me way longer to do that. Or, you know, I'm not getting necessarily the right main idea from the intro paragraph. So then is it worse for me to be doing that? Or is it worse, you know, for me to keep using the strategy if I'm getting a main idea wrong? So I get a lot of questions about critical strategy. Critical strategy requires an exceptional amount of practice for you to be good at it. And so that's where the non-negotiable sort of piece of it is. You have to have critical strategy to be at your own maximum effectiveness on the reading test. You absolutely have to have that to be as effective as you can be. When I take the T's, I absolutely promise you anything that is passage-based, I use my critical strategy. I use my scratch paper to outline my critical strategy. And I can also absolutely promise you it does not take me an extra second to do that. It takes me a lot less time than it's taking you probably at this current point to get through the same passage, because when I go to answer my 6 or my 7 questions, I know the answer to them off the top of my head, because you're putting the time into the critical strategy. You're putting the time into thinking about what is the main idea that they're building, that they're about to build right here in front of me. What is the focus of each paragraph? And how does it all come together? If you put your thought into that, you won't have to think when you see questions, because your questions are things like, what's the main idea? What's the topic? What's a good way to summarize the whole thing? And another way of thinking of a summary would be to read your little focus notes. If you read each of your focus notes that you had written next to the paragraphs, you would have yourself a summary. So the time that you add in stopping for a second when you get to the end of a paragraph and writing down what you need to write down for that paragraph is absolutely more than made up for when you're on your questions and you're not having to go back and pull the passage back up and think about it, and it's not taking you long to figure out what the best answer is. That said, if you have practiced it to the extent that you should have, it should not even feel like it takes you any extra time. For me, and of course, I would certainly hope that I am the most practiced of absolutely anyone I will ever encounter when it comes to that strategy, because I designed it, but it does not take me extra time. I would say I'm faster at doing it that way than I would be at just trying to read from beginning to end. Because you try to read from beginning to end, you get a little bored, you get a little lost, you get a little where you're like, wait a second, what did they just say a second ago about the, oh yeah, they said this. It's so worth taking just a second to pause. And it really is just a second. So if you have mastered critical strategy and you have mastered main idea identification, which are honestly two different things that both have to be mastered, all the time you really need is just a second to write a word or two on your scratch paper. As a note about that, the end of this packet is a couple of pages that have content that, by the way, is not my content. The last 3 pages, everything else in this packet is. And it has like some screenshots from the official practice test that looks the same way computer formatting wise as the real test does. And it points out back there some of the ways that you switch these strategies you've been using from paper to computerized. So of course, when you take the real test, it's on the computer. You can no longer actually literally write next to your paragraphs. And so I demonstrate at the end of this packet, how do you carry over that critical strategy, and just do the same thing on your scratch paper. So you essentially just make a little box, make a little space that's going to be for that passage, write the title of the passage like Chimney Swifts, and then write your main idea, write your focus number 1 for your first paragraph, focus number 2, focus number 3, couple of words each, nothing fancy. The only extra time you're spending is just the time to write a quick word down, and you will more than make that up when you know the answers to all the questions right off the top of your head. Of course, that's not even going down the accuracy path, because that's the one thing that you could pay all the money in the world, give all the time in the world. You could be going 95 miles an hour or 0 miles an hour. If you're not accurate, it doesn't matter. And having the critical strategy will absolutely refine your accuracy to a level that I don't think I have words to describe. So having perfected that strategy for years and years and years, it is hard for them to put a question in front of me that I don't pretty much know the answer to right off the top of my head. So when I get down to those 2 answers that are both good, but one of them's great, it's a very fast process for me to get rid of the first 2, figure out which one's good and which one's great. That's all really easy. And I attribute all of that to critical strategy. On that note, the other thing I want to note before we begin is the 2 answers strategy. So I mention this here and there. I don't do as fabulous as a job as I would like to about this with classes. So I'm going to mention it right away to make sure that you are implementing this. Every time that you do at least reading questions, I really use this in every section except for math, I would say, but definitely reading. When you read a question, you should always eliminate 2 answers right away. There's always 2 answers that don't even resemble what you're trying to do. And then there's 2 other answers that are like a good one, something that's probably true and possibly something that's pretty accurate to the situation that you're trying to address, but then another one that's even better and it's even more accurate, or it's better related to the situation you're trying to address. And so there's kind of a couple of steps that you take. Let me find a little bit of blank paper here. So the first thing that you do is you read the question, of course. The first thing you do is you read the passage, but I'm assuming that that's a given. So you read the actual question, and you actually are going to read it twice. So you read the question the first time, and you literally just read the question. You read it again immediately, and this is totally subconscious. You're not even really making a conscious effort to do this. Again, it's not taking up your time or anything like that. You immediately read the question again, and you emphasize the keywords. I will do my very best to do a good job of showing that as we're doing our work in this class tonight. So you read the question in its entirety, and then you come back across and you just find the words that make the question. For example, in the third paragraph, what is the author's main purpose? And then I come back and I'm like, third paragraph, main purpose. So whatever the key words are that are what you're actually looking for in your answer choices, you come back and you get those right after you read the question. So that's like step 1A, we'll say. So then step 2 would be to eliminate 2 answers that are way off from whatever it is you're trying to do. And then step 3, you now have 2 answers left. Sometimes it's easy to get rid of a third one. So sometimes it's just very obvious what the answer is. No harm in that. Go ahead and get rid of the third one if that's the case and move on. Usually the last 2 are much harder to tell the difference between than the first 2. And so what you want to do is you want to go back to those keywords from the question again before you try to pick between one choice and the other choice. Because what happens is you have 2 answer choices. They're both, if they made the final cut like that, they're both true. They're both good. They both relate well to the passage and to the context and to whatever else you're trying to relate them to. So that's dangerous, right? Because they're both going to satisfy a lot of conditions. What they don't both do is satisfy every keyword of the question. So for example, if I go back to the example that I just did, third paragraph, main purpose. Maybe one of the 2 answers that I've got sitting here would be a better answer for the second paragraph, or would be a better answer for the whole entire passage. And then the other one is maybe a better answer based on that third paragraph. So there could be 2 things that are very good logical conclusions that you could definitely come up with having read the passage, but one of them might be a logical conclusion overall from the whole thing, from the main idea, and the other might be more of a logical conclusion from the third paragraph. So you always read your keywords again, and you're glad that you did it right here because now you know what they are and you've already got that ready to go. Then you pick the answer that satisfies the keywords. So those are a couple of notes about strategy. If you're still struggling with the critical reading strategy, all I can say is keep at it. I always encourage you guys, as you well know, to stay the heck away from all material that is not mine. And I still encourage that exact same thing. I will say this, as far as just practicing critical strategy, just practicing that idea of mastering, looking at a paragraph and identifying why it's there and what it does to serve the main idea, you could use a lot of things for that. You could use a tease book as long as you're not answering their questions and you're not looking at their keys and stuff like that. You can use, of course, anything that's in any of your reading packets, all of your reading packets. every single thing that's passage-based, you should have used your strategy to do. So every single thing that's put in front of you that can have a critical strategy so far, you have hopefully used it for. I do have, in some instances, I have some like miscellaneous kind of passages that are simple ones, like what we usually use in the Reading 1 classes that I might be able to send you. And of course, the advantage of those is I know what the outline should look like for them. So then you can send them back to me and outline them. That is not worth your time unless you feel that you are still struggling with it. So if you walk into your test feeling like, dang, half the time that I outline a passage, it's wrong, and that's in your head, that's going to hurt you. So if you are doubting yourself on some level with that, keep doing that critical strategy. Check your main idea and focus breakdowns with me, and keep working on doing that. Keep implementing all the strategies from Reading 1. I am going to talk about the Reading 1 strategies again in this class, but not to quite the depth that I did in the other one. So if you're truly struggling with critical strategy, you may need a combination of this class and that one. I may have already recommended, or I may currently recommend, a different version of Reading 1. There's 2 different versions. So if you're struggling with a particular reading class and you've only taken it once, you've only taken one of the packets that goes with it, there is another one as well. But that's critical. Without critical strategy, you can't move forward and get good at anything else, because you could be great at thinking about a purpose, great at thinking about a summary, great at thinking about a logical conclusion. And if you can't outline to get yourself to those, you'll still end up coming up short. So in Reading 1, we talked about the critical strategy, which we definitely just reiterated, so I won't reiterate that a third time. And so we think about, at a glance, this is like a broad kind of version of the strategy, reading a passage with a specific purpose in mind. That specific purpose being, why is this passage here? Why did the author write this? What are they trying to tell me? Are they trying to convince me of something? Are they trying to inform me of something? Are they trying to tell me a story? If they're trying to inform me of something, what is that something? So what is their point? Those are all things that we can figure out very, very early on. So the general concept behind the critical reading strategy is to predict at the beginning. So during your first paragraph, you're predicting. You read your first paragraph, you'll see a topic sentence, which is usually the very first sentence, gives you a very general idea of what you're about to read about. So we always have our topic identified in the intro paragraph. We also always have our main idea identified in the intro. And our main idea may or may not be in a sentence called the thesis. You'll see that I do have that defined in this packet. The thesis statement refers to, that's like a vocabulary term, that refers to a specific sentence that has the main idea specifically in it. Or another way of thinking of that or wording that is the main idea sentence. I don't focus heavily on thesis. That's not the best way to do things, because like you know, it's all strategic and it's all looking down at it from a high level and thinking of things as a general big strategy. So what I want you to do is read the intro paragraph, and from that whole thing, from the whole way that they're introducing the passage, predict what is the topic, what is the main idea going to be for this entire passage. It's reasonably easy to tell what the main idea of the whole thing is going to be from the intro. One of the questions I get sometimes, so if you're in secondary reading, you may have asked me this question, is are there cases where I'm wrong about my main idea in the first paragraph because I didn't have the info that I needed? Yes. And I mentioned this in Reading 1. I talk about checking back. So you do need to check back with your main idea when you're done reading the passage. That said, there are very few instances where you will make an adjustment. So when you finish your whole passage and you go on to your questions, before you go on to your questions, it is certainly worth noting whether your main idea that you predicted prior to having read the passage was fully accurate, or whether the passage might have kind of developed a little bit beyond what it looked like it was going to. 99% of the time, if you do a good job of reading and summing up the intro paragraph, you will have the correct main idea. Something that I do want to focus on in this class, in the streamlining process, is the things that sort of make, like, for example, sometimes I'll have someone say, how would you outline this? And I have to be really careful with that, because I'll say, well, I might outline it completely different than you. I might say this focus is completely different than you say it is, and we might both be on the right track. So we want to move from broad to specific when we're thinking about this. So when we're thinking about a main idea, for example, at the beginning, we start with a topic and we start with one word. And then when we move to our main idea, we want to start kind of simply, and then we want to add a little to it, and maybe add a little to it again. And if there's more that you can add to it, add it again. There's multiple right answers, because when you develop a main idea, you could say, like, for example, let's say that our topic, this is stealing something from the other reading class. Let's say we have a topic in our essay of Alzheimer's disease. Usually with the topic, we kind of just pick one and leave it alone. You certainly could be a little bit more specific with your topic, but there's not a need for that, because you're going to use your main idea, not your topic. So let's say that I identify it's going to be about Alzheimer's, and I move on to my main idea. So at first, I might write that it's death from Alzheimer's, that I think and I predict that this passage is going to talk about death from Alzheimer's. That is more specific than just saying Alzheimer's. So I've narrowed that a bit, but I want to continue assessing and say, is that all of the info that I have? Is that everything I think I can predict, or is there more? If you remember the passage I'm referencing, there's a very important element of that one, which is that they're going to focus on a particular study about the death of people with Alzheimer's disease. And that's a critical detail that you add. You might have another situation that looks just like this, and you might write down one word and you might add another one. And there might be a couple things you can add that aren't that critical. They might expand it, make it a little bit more clear, a little bit more specific, but they won't make or break it. It depends on the passage, and you will know with what's in front of you whether you have to get more specific or whether you just can. So when you look at your intro paragraph, you read your intro paragraph, you absorb what the author is going to talk about, you can see what kind of point they're trying to make, and you decide what is the best way to categorize my topic and how specific do I need to be to get everything out of the main idea that they have given me here. There's a good example of this, and I will include this into your packet. I'm going to pull this up, hopefully on the fly real quick here. Let me think whether it's, I think it's in reading 3, but it might be 2. My apologies if I do pull up the wrong one. There's a really good example of this that you have probably outlined already, and it's right here. This is the original Reading 2 packet. So you have this packet. In Reading 2 class, I mentioned to you that this popcorn passage is one of the passages that you could wind up seeing. And so even though I don't have questions with it in here, I mentioned that you are best off if you go ahead and outline this so that you've outlined it before. So this is Reading 3, original packet. I might have said reading 2 a second ago. I'm very sorry if I did. Reading 3 packet. This is the regular reading 3 class. It's not one of the secondaries. It's right at the beginning of the packet. You probably already know what passage this is. And I basically told you that there's no questions on it in this particular instance, but it made it as part of the crop. And so you may as well outline it because there is a possibility that you could see this passage. So let's talk about how this works in this case. Pause the video for a second and read the intro paragraph and think about what you always think about when you read an intro paragraph. Think about your topic and your main idea. I'm actually going to prepare to write them down here. So pause me real quick. Think about, read that intro paragraph. Think about your topic. Think about your main idea and do that stages piece of things. So after you've identified your topic, identify a main idea and ask yourself, do I know a little bit more than that? Can I say a little more in my main idea? And then ask yourself again, can I say a little bit more? And then when you get all that done and you've kind of listed out and expanded your main idea all the way, then you can kind of say, is all of this necessary? Do I need every word of this main idea to move forward successfully? Or can I acknowledge that some of that is just me being a little more specific, but it's not necessary? And my goal in what I'm saying here is you and I could completely outline a passage differently, and it may or may not matter, because if we miss something, one of us misses something that's really critical and changes the turn of direction where the passage is going, then that would affect our outline negatively. If I just choose to be a little bit more specific with my wording and you choose to be a little more broad, you might get through your passage more quickly. I might get through my passage more slowly. I might have a teeny bit more info, but I also might just have something more that I have to sort through. So there's no perfect recipe for how you outline these. The perfect recipe is to start broad, always start with a word or a couple of words, see if you can add a little more, see if you can add something again. This is a great example of that. So if you haven't paused me yet, pause, do that intro paragraph. And then as soon as you finish the intro paragraph, play it again, because I'll have you pause to do the rest of the passage also. So I am going to give the answer. So if you have not paused me, pause me immediately. I'm going to give the answer. So topic of this one, I'm sure everybody agreed on that one, is popcorn. And so when it's broad, when we're being broad, we always agree, right? We always agree when it's really broad. Topics are much more likely to be the same from person to person than main ideas. There are cases where we might even name the topic differently, though, and as long as we ultimately get to the same place, that's okay. When we first started the main idea here, most likely what you kind of said was something like history of popcorn. And again, there's multiple ways you could have built this, especially if you started somewhere and then you added. I started with history of popcorn. So here's your broad. You and I are more likely to have agreed on this first part of this than maybe we would be if it was really specific. But again, there's no perfect answer to this, because the bottom line is you need to understand what you think is in front of you. So if you did write history of popcorn, you thought of this the same way that I did. And then you go back and you think, is there anything else that I think is coming? So if I'm sitting here and I'm predicting what's coming in these next 3 paragraphs, do I think I have fully predicted that, or do I think I've left out a bit of what I know is coming? And so what I did is I added, well, history and importance of popcorn, because they kind of talk about, oh, it's in all these different places, fun and festivities, and then how big of an industry it is. So you really have a couple of things going on where importance kind of becomes a thing. So my second stage was, oh, okay, how about history and importance of popcorn? Had you said history of popcorn and moved on, that would not be tragic. You would figure out based on your paragraph focuses that needed to be added in at some point. And then you could add again, because you could say, well, cultural importance specifically, because when they're talking about festivities, and they're talking about theaters, and most people go to theaters with friends or family or something like that, that's like a cultural thing. So it's part of America's culture is what they're getting at there. So I might say history of popcorn and cultural importance of popcorn. I could also say that there's a long history of popcorn. So I could say long history of popcorn and cultural importance of popcorn. And so the point that I'm making here is I can keep adding to this, and it doesn't probably affect how I'm going to see the next 3 paragraphs. It just affects my understanding. For me, if I can add something and then add something else, I will, because the more I can think about, well, is there more that they're showing me here? Is there more I can add here? The more prepared I am when I bump into it a couple minutes later. Again, critical strategy is something you should get very, very fast at. This doesn't take long. So having written down popcorn as your topic, written down history, added importance, even if you did go back and write cultural importance and long history, none of that took you any time at all. It just takes me forever to say it because I'm a long-winded person. So now go ahead and do the focuses of each paragraph just so that you can have the experience of outlining this, because that's something I had you do while you were in your original class, and I did not follow up with all of you on that. So whatever you chose for your main idea, just to be very clear, doesn't matter. If you chose your main idea as history of popcorn, fine. If you chose history and importance of popcorn, that's a little bit better of a main idea, a little more on point, but you'll survive either way. If you added all the other fancy stuff, like you noticed that it's a long history or you noticed that it's of cultural importance, then that's even better. But no matter where you stood on that main idea, the fact that you stopped and thought about it at all, that is the key to the whole thing. So stopping and thinking, oh, this is about popcorn and it's about the history of popcorn. You can be so brief, so simple, and that's all you need to do to be absolutely heads above everybody else that saw this passage the same day. So pause if you have not paused so that you can do your other 3 focuses, and I will almost immediately here start giving those. So this first paragraph after the intro, the way that I outlined this is I kind of said, like, this is the really ancient history of popcorn. So after they introduce the fact that it's important and that it's got a long history, the next thing that they did is they went all the way back in time to like people living in a bat cave. And they said that it was like one of the earliest uses of the corn crop. And so this is like ancient history. We went all the way back. So they chose to start our popcorn journey by starting at the beginning from a sequential standpoint. So you might have had more detail than that in your focus. You might have had a little bit less detail than that. You might have just said history. You're probably okay either way. The third paragraph really kind of goes into America specifically. So it starts right out with the American love affair with popcorn. And so it's kind of American history of popcorn. It starts out when popcorn was first sold in theaters, and it kind of takes us through like a timeline, essentially from 1912 to 1950s. And again, I feel like we're mostly kind of in a sequential order. I don't know why it just did that. Sorry. And then the last paragraph is, you could have outlined the last paragraph a couple of ways. So essentially it kind of says, you know, it's kind of about the development or the evolution of the business side. So they talked already a lot about the different ways that popcorn has been sold and the different ways that it's been of importance. And this is talking about the fact that when popcorn started to decline in sales after this period of time that we talked about, microwave popcorn was kind of what saved the day. And so you might have said that your focus was microwave popcorn for this one. That would be a good focus to have. You might have said it was more about the business or the revenue or the evolution of it. You might have said it was more about having popcorn at home, because earlier in the passage was more about going and getting popcorn. So the point that I want to make very clear from class originally to here is the fact that you can outline in a lot of different ways, and really be very successful with having the guidance that you need from this process that you've put in place. So it's not about having a perfect outline. It's not about having an outline that matches my outline. It's just about thinking, how much can I read into this? How much do I know? And ultimately, it's about being able to scan across a packet from each paragraph, going across each paragraph and building what the passage is. So as kind of a reminder from when we did this in class, a really good way to get used to structure. So if you're having trouble with critical strategy at all, a good way to get used to structure is to think of, well, what if I wrote essays? What if I was this person that was writing these passages? And come up with topics and come up with main ideas. Think of things you could write about from a really broad standpoint, like a topic, from a more specific standpoint, from a main idea, and think about, how would I structure a conversation or an essay? How would I do paragraphs about something that I care about? So pick something that matters to you, pick something that you're knowledgeable about, and think, how would I write this if I were to write this and put it into 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs, like what you see when you're actually reading on the test. So the example that I used in the original Reading 1 class was like cars. So I said, well, our topic will be cars. That is a massive topic. That's why I use that one, as that's like one of the biggest topics I could possibly give you. So if I say I'm going to write about cars, that doesn't give you hardly any indication of what the heck I might say. If I say, oh, I'm going to talk about, gas mileage, that's closer, right? So if I say, oh, I'm going to talk about gas mileage, you have a much better idea of what aspect of cars I'm going to talk about here, but it's still a little vague. So you hearing me say, oh, I'm going to write about gas mileage, you can't necessarily see a roadmap in your head just yet of what my paragraphs are going to say. So the main idea needs to be a little more specific for it to be obvious what I'm going to say or what my paragraphs are going to be. This is probably the first thing, if you're the one who's reading it, that you outline. So when you're first reading somebody else's intro, let's use the example of when you go to read my intro about my article about gas mileage, you might start by writing down gas mileage, and then you might expand that a little bit, like what we just did, to include like the cars that have the best gas mileage. So that really helps to clarify, because if I say, oh, I'm going to write about gas mileage, that could mean that I'm going to write about the aspects of car design that cause gas mileage. That could mean I'm going to write about the way a truck is designed versus the way a car is designed and why they don't have the same gas mileage. On the contrary, that's not at all what I want to write about. What I want to write about is, if you're going to go car shopping and gas mileage is important to you, this is what you would want to think about. So cars with the best gas mileage, this is a good main idea. So as I'm building this, I'm really doing the same thing that you're doing as you're pulling one apart that somebody else wrote, in recognizing a big topic, recognizing sort of a subtopic, or recognizing the start of a main idea, and then recognizing, oh, they gave us a little more info here that can really tell us where we're headed. Knowing that the main idea is cars with the best gas mileage helps, but it doesn't tell me exactly where I'm headed. There are still tons of different ways that the paragraphs could look from this point on through the end of the essay. That will always be the case. No matter how specific a main idea gets, the paragraphs could be any number of possible combinations. And that's your job as the reader, is to figure out, in this particular instance, what did they decide they wanted to use as their paragraphs? What did they want to focus on? And remember, each of your focuses, so each of your paragraphs, explains the main idea. So each paragraph is part of explaining your main idea. Each paragraph has details in it that justify that paragraph. So the paragraph itself has its own little miniature main idea, and that miniature main idea supports the main idea, and then the little details that are in each paragraph support that paragraph's focus. So the whole idea is to think about the passage as a whole first, and then think about each paragraph individually and why they are what they are based on what the whole is doing. So if I'm going to write about cars with the best gas mileage, just as a couple of examples of what my paragraphs might look like, a lot of times you're going to see, and you probably remember me talking about this in the other Reading One class, a lot of times there's going to be a background paragraph. So a lot of times there's going to be something that talks about, what gas mileage is in the first place, or it maybe tells a little story about the fact that I recently went car shopping or something like that. So a background is one of the ones that a lot of times we will recognize. We will label it as a background paragraph, and that will kind of be its focus. With gas mileage of cars, that could be a lot of different things. You could have all kinds of different content in there. But the bottom line is, if the second paragraph kind of goes off in its own direction a little bit and isn't exactly about the main idea, but is explaining something you need to know or something you need to understand, it's probably kind of a background. Here's 3 examples. So one way that I might organize this is I might have my paragraph, my first paragraph besides my background might be about Hondas. So as a whole brand, I might talk about Hondas. Honda makes several cars that have good fuel economy. So I might talk about the way Hondas are designed, or I might give some of the numbers of Hondas and what their gas mileage is. And then I could do the same thing with Toyotas and then Nissan. So I could have my paragraph focuses that end up written down as I'm reading through could be background, Honda, Toyota, Nissan. Or in a similar instance, it could be like, here's the number 1 rated car, number 2 rated car, number 3 rated car from the government website that actually ranks them by the very, very best gas mileage car, and then the second best gas mileage car. So these would be specific make and models that were rated number 1, rated number 2. So maybe this one is a Honda Civic, and maybe this one's a Toyota Corolla, and I'm not the one deciding what ones I'm writing about, because I'm writing about the ones that are ranked 1, 2, and 3. So that would be another entirely different way that I could write about the exact same main idea. A third that I did not provide in the other class is I could talk about more general types of cars. I could talk about hybrids, and then I could talk about coupes, which are the cars that have 2 doors. And then I could talk about like station wagons. So that would be like model body chassis types. So there's a lot of different ways that I could explain the exact same main idea. All of them are okay. All of them are acceptable. You as the reader on the tees, you would be able to see and detect and outline how I did end up writing my essay. And behind every one of the essays that you are going to end up reading on the test will be something very similar, where whatever they picked is sitting in front of you, and figuring out what those focuses are will help you to understand and put together what the main idea is. We will outline a couple of passages today, and then there will be continuing practice. Hopefully you're feeling pretty good about critical strategy already. I do want to go over purpose some more. You'll notice this page does not look familiar. So in reading 2, I used a different page, and I have streamlined that page completely, where we can talk about passage types a little bit differently. So first of all, very important to note, if you didn't really focus on this when you took reading 2, purpose and passage style go hand in hand. So the author's purpose is exactly what it sounds like. It's the reason that the author wrote the passage in the first place. So purpose can be asked in multiple ways. You can be asked to explain the purpose, where you would say the purpose is to explain the process for purchasing a car. And then you could be asked for the passage style, which is a little bit more general, where you would say, oh, it was intended to inform me, or it was intended to explain something to me. They go hand in hand. So when you read something and you do your outlining, both of these two things should be obvious when you complete your outline. So prior to you actually seeing any question about this. And this is where we blend reading 1 and 2 together now. So now we don't see them as separate. We don't look at the critical reading strategy separately from all these other things. Now they are one. Just like you find the main idea as quickly as possible, you find the purpose as quickly as possible. Finding the purpose will immediately allow you to identify the passage style, and those should be things you're recognizing and realizing right away when you're reading something. Main idea and purpose have a lot in common. Sometimes a purpose is quite literally identical to a main idea. Sometimes it's not. So for example, I could say that my main idea is how to buy a car, and my purpose could be to explain how to buy a car, so they're almost identical. I could say that my main idea is elderly are at a higher risk of falling than anybody else, and my purpose could be to write this to hopefully help someone be aware of this risk and prevent a fall, in addition to just making people knowledgeable about the situation. So sometimes purpose goes above and beyond main idea, and sometimes it doesn't. Again, if you're using critical strategy and you're mastering these passages as you're seeing them, they'll both be obvious right off the bat. You'll know your main idea, you'll know your focuses, you'll be able to outline and summarize your passage right off the top of your head. You'll know the purpose, and you'll know the passage style. And keep in mind, summary is still coming up because summary was reading 3. But keep in mind, summary is your outline. So when you're outlining paragraphs and you're writing down on your scratch paper what each focus is, you are essentially writing the summary. So if you were asked to summarize a text, you would essentially take your paragraph focuses and put them into a list, and you would look for the answer choice that is the closest to that list you made when you read the passage. So these all blend together. They should all happen before you even look at your first question. So they can ask purpose and passage type interchangeably. They can ask them together. They can combine them into one. You can see elements of passage style within an answer to a purpose question. We'll see all of this again as a reminder tonight. So you want to make sure you have a clear idea of what passages look like, what their identifiers are, and how to tie it to purpose. Here is where all of the questions I get from this class come from. Anytime I get a question in my email about a passage type, the question will always say something like, well, The key says that this is a blank passage type, but I felt like it was a blank passage type. Anytime somebody asks me about a passage type, it's because there's elements of more than one in there. So it's not like something is 100% obviously informative and then you just pick persuasive. That's not what happens. What happens is something is informative and it has persuasive elements and you're torn between the two of them. If that happens, if you remember that happening on any of your purpose work before, you're missing the purpose. So if you read something and it's got some persuasive to it and it's got some informative to it and you can't pick between them, you're not thinking about purpose, because the author sat down with one particular plan in mind. The author sat down to convince you of something or to convey an opinion to you, or they sat down to inform you. So I could be largely sitting down with the intent of informing you about something, but you could see what my viewpoint is a time or two, and it would still be informative because my overall intent was to inform. So even if there's persuasive elements, you will largely feel like the passage as a whole was to inform. That was the bigger, more obvious purpose. Same thing in the opposite sense. If I sit down and my plan is to convince you that you should agree with me on an issue, I might include some facts. I might cite some sources, just like you would in an informative. But I'm doing that because I want to say, look at this piece of information. See, that means that you should think this. So I'm using my facts and my statistics and my citations to convince you. So don't forget purpose. There is no word more important in reading, all of reading, than purpose. Always think about the author sat down with a blank piece of paper in front of them for what reason? Why did they write this? What kind of passage were they aiming for? What was their point? And the point would be the same thing as the main idea. And what was their purpose? Always look for that and you won't get them mixed up. I have combined, for simplicity's sake, from the old version of this, informative and expository for your current purposes are the same. The TEAS considers informative and expository interchangeable. So like it says here, these two will be used interchangeably. You will not be forced to pick between them. You will never have a situation where something is informative and you have to pick informative or expository. A hint based on that. So let's say that you are sitting there and you have A, persuasive, B, expository, C, informative. So I didn't tell you that they can't put them both there. What I said is they can't make you pick between them. So if you had a situation where two of your answer choices meant the same thing as each other, and I am telling you with TEAS, you have complete permission to consider expository and informative to be the same thing, well, then neither of those can be the answer, because you can't pick between them. One of those is not better than the other. So then that takes both of them out of the running. So I'm not saying they can't put them both there. I'm saying if you see them both there, it can't be either one of them. You could never pick informative over expository in the same context. And so there's a lot of review of what these are that you should definitely read through if you're having any more trouble with purpose. So the primary purpose, you're going to keep seeing this in like huge caps. The primary purpose of an informative is to inform an audience or explain something to an audience. There's a main point and there are ideas that support that main point. The ideas that are supported by factual informational details. These are mostly neutral in tone. So maybe here and there you can tell that the author agrees or disagrees with something in particular, but it's not obvious what the author's opinion is, and they are certainly not sitting there conveying their opinion. So it is either a mostly or fully neutral tone. So it is not overly obvious what the author's viewpoint is. It does not seem to show through, and if it does, it is a momentary, quick tone, and it returns to an informative tone. When you walk away from an informative, you've had the opportunity to learn something. There are persuasives that do not seem like persuasives at all. They seem like they're just kind of random. There's an example. Let me see if that packet is still sitting right here. I don't think it is. So there's an example in one of your packets. There's an article that's about like George Washington. It's a little paragraph thing. I'm pretty sure it's reading 3, if you remember it. One of the first ones we did in reading 3 class, I believe. And it essentially is talking about how history can change the way that people think about someone or something. And so this particular writer is talking about George Washington, and they favor George Washington. And in this person's opinion, he has not been over glorified by time. But then he kind of questions, but has he? And so if you don't remember that passage at all, you can totally pause this video and find it. There's only one passage that's like that. It's like 2 little bitty paragraphs. It's right at the beginning of reading 3. If it's not, it's at the beginning of reading 2, but I'm pretty sure it's 3. And that's a really good example. The reason I'm bringing that one up, that is a great example of one that doesn't seem informative or persuasive. And it really doesn't seem persuasive. But you've got to read through there, and you've got to say, you didn't have an opportunity to learn anything. There's no factual information, statistical information. There's no educational details in it at all. It's like totally pondering the philosophy of history. And so if you read something and it's not an opinion piece necessarily, but it's also not got factual information and an opportunity to learn something, it cannot be informative. Definitely, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, check out that passage. Because you'll see that one is the least obvious persuasive of probably anything that I ever gave you that is persuasive. The reason it's persuasive is because 2 of the answers are terrible, and then the 2 that remain after those 2 are persuasive and informative. There's nothing you got informed of. You could fact check a lot of things that are found in an informative. Again, with that little example that I just gave, there's nothing you could fact check with that. It was all pondering and, gee, does history do this? Do people think differently when something happened a long time ago? It was all sort of questions rather than anything that you could fact check. They contain little to no bias, because the author's primary purpose is to inform you, to give you facts and explain something to you in a neutral manner. So a point is introduced in the intro paragraph, and then each paragraph thereafter focuses on an aspect of that point. So the details of each paragraph support one aspect of the big point, and then each paragraph supports the bigger paragraph, and they're all put together to teach you about something or explain something to you or inform you of something. So expository and informative. Make sure that you know not only this usage, informative, expository, but also the to inform and to explain. Those get a little bit more fuzzy as we keep going. Persuasive or argumentative, they almost always call it persuasive, is to persuade, to convince, or to deliver an opinion. Usually when you see this as a tagline in an answer, it will say to persuade. So I wouldn't expect you to need to answer something as to deliver an opinion. This is for you. Something I was not as clear as I would have liked to be in reading 2 with is that one of the types of persuasive is not what you would actually call persuasive. So a persuasive is anything that is, again, primary purpose. When you're thinking about passage type, you should say the phrase primary purpose constantly. Primary purpose: to deliver an opinion, to persuade someone, to convince someone. If your primary purpose is any of those things, including just giving your opinion, that is a persuasive. So the person doesn't have to be aggressive. They don't have to be saying, you should do this, you should think this, why would you think that? They don't have to have those aggressive aspects to their article. And that's where I see people miss persuasive. So anytime I ever get asked about an article with a passage type that is persuasive, it's always one of these. So the ones that actually persuade, everybody always gets those. The ones that deliver an opinion, but they don't seem to be trying to push you to that opinion, those are the ones people struggle with. So this includes like opinion pieces. So if you see something has an opinion in the name, so there's a article in one of your mock tests that's called Opinion on American Poetry. Boom, right there. It's the title literally says Opinion on American Poetry. You know it's persuasive, whether that person was pushy or not. Editorials. A lot of people don't know what editorial means. And again, I wasn't as clear in the class as I would have liked to be about that. An editorial is an opinion piece directed at a specific audience. The term editorial comes from newspapers originally, which is like you could write an editorial and they would publish in the newspaper so that you could convey your opinion about something. And again, just like this passage type, there were editorials that were like, you should be on my side. And there were editorials that were just, here's my opinion. So if the primary purpose of something is to deliver an opinion or to deliver an opinion and then convince you to come to that opinion, either one, then you are dealing with a persuasive. So you'll see a very similar list right here, except a lot of these elements will be backwards from informative. So these are written with the primary purpose of delivering an opinion or focusing on an opinion. There's something wrong with the wording here. Sorry about that. But delivering or focusing on an opinion. Some of them will just give the opinion. Others will avidly attempt to get you to have the same opinion. Another way to look at this is you won't get educated about something. If you do learn something from a persuasive, the facts that you did learn were followed by, so this is why you should think this, or so this is why you shouldn't agree with that. So these will contain a lot of statements that are opinions or statements that contain opinions. The tone of these articles is biased. We can see the author's viewpoint often or constantly. They may contain verifiable facts. So this is where you have a little bit of crossover with informative. But the facts are there with the intent of helping persuade you. So an informative could have facts that are there to help educate you. And then maybe you see a little bit of an opinion for just a second, but not with the intent to persuade you. And so now you have the opposite. You're going to have facts that are there, but they're only there to convince you of something. They're not trying to teach you about this detail. They're trying to take this detail and get you to agree with them because they gave you this detail. You will often walk away from a persuasive passage feeling that you didn't really learn anything. So back to that George Washington passage example. So that one did not feel like it was somebody's opinion. It certainly did not feel like it was persuasive, but you also walked away no wiser than you were before because it was all very contemplating the meaning of these questions based. So that ended up being persuasive. Narratives are to tell a story or to entertain. This is where the tagline starts getting important. So to entertain, that can only be used with a narrative, meaning to tell a story can only mean the same thing as to entertain and vice versa. You can't say something was designed to entertain you if you're not also willing to say it was a story. So there's a lot of things that a story has that other things don't. So in a story, there are characters, there are events that are involving the characters, usually in a chronological timeline. There is somewhat of a plot. There's something going on that's working on resolving or whatever. And there is a setting. Stories could be fiction or nonfiction, but their purpose is to actually play out events that involve characters, real or fake. So think of telling like your friend or your family member a story. That doesn't look the same as informing someone, and it doesn't look the same as persuading someone. So there's people involved. There's something that happened. There's a beginning, middle, and end. That's an important thing to look for. So it's in sequential timeline, and there seems to be a place where it started, a middle point, and a place where it ended. And so unless that's what you have, you do not have entertain. So you can't pick something like, for example, there was a passage at one point about these cats, and the author was clearly in favor of these cats and how great they were. They weren't being persuasive. They were just telling you about certain attributes of these cats, but they had a tone that would say that they really like these cats and probably have 15 of them in their own house. And so it was entertaining. I mean, to read about something from someone who really cares about whatever it is can be entertaining. So that's where you have to be careful with the tease or the hesse, is if you're going to use to entertain in this setting, you have to mean that it is literally a story. So even if you were totally entertained by something, if it wasn't a story, you cannot say that was its purpose. There are not very many narratives on the test in comparison to the other passage types. You will see by far the most informative and expository, then persuasive, then technical, then narrative, and then expressive. So you will not see a lot of narratives. The average one tease test would have one, maybe two narratives at the most. And they are stories. An expressive is to express feelings. So an expressive is essentially a narrative, and again, gets a little blurry because an expressive is a narrative a lot of the time. So it's a story. But the story is only there to tell how someone feels. You can't do a good job of describing somebody's feelings without a story or a context for how that person is feeling. So as you read a story, it's your job to think, is this being told so that I can hear about the events? Or are the events being told to me because they're trying to explain how someone feels? Expressive passages are rare. They are very rare. You would literally not find more than one on a single test, and there would be many tests that would go by that would not have an expressive. I cannot remember the last time I answered expressive on one of my tests, so they are very rare. In order to answer expressive, you would have to be very certain. You would have to have a very strong feeling that the story was only there to allow you to see the intense emotion that someone was having. They would have to talk a lot more about how someone was feeling than about the things that were going on with that person. And then one other note about expressives, and this is very important right here. I get asked this question a lot. Context is very important to an expressive. Not only are expressives typically in a narrative-like format, so it is an indicator that it's typically like a story. So an expressive is going to express feelings within a story, within a narrative type experience. There is also a limit to who could write something with this intent. The intent to express feelings is not an intent that every author is able to have. A very good example where I get a lot of questions from one of the, I want to say it's the Reading 5 packet, but I could be totally wrong about that. There's one where an HR person writes a memo about how people have been taking each other's food out of the fridge. And it's kind of a memo that's like threatening them that these are the consequences if you do this. Plus, it's really mean and rude to take somebody's food. And I always get asked, why is that not express feelings? An HR representative is a professional, and a memo is a professional document. An HR rep, by default, would not write something with the intent of expressing feelings. They would write something to inform you about a policy or consequences if a policy is violated, or possibly even inform you about how people have been feeling about this situation, which is kind of what happened with the one that I'm describing. However, an HR representative or anybody that is in a professional position would not be caught writing an expressive. So a professor would not write an expressive to their students. An HR rep would not write an expressive to their employees. So remember that professional settings do not count for that. Professional settings, they're usually informing you of a situation, consequences involved in the situation, and they might possibly make note of how people have been feeling or how people might feel when this happens, but it is not the HR rep's feelings. It's not her that has these feelings. And even if it was her that had these feelings and she got her lunch stolen, an HR rep cannot put out a professional communication with the intent of expressing emotion. The last one is technical. So technicals, a lot of those are easy: charts, graphs, tables, maps, phone books, anything that's not a passage. The one thing I want to clarify on technical. So every single TEAS test has a cooking recipe, for one thing. Every single test rotation, there is a cooking recipe. A recipe is technical because a technical is basically pure data with the intent of delivering statistical, numerical, or, key part here, instructional information. Instructions are technical. So if it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, or if it's like option 1, option 2, option 3. If it's written that way, that is technical. So there's a couple of questions that I commonly get. One of them is recipes. So a recipe would most definitely fall into the technical category. That said, about half the time that you get a recipe on the TEAS test, and I am not kidding when I say every student who ever took the TEAS test ever in the history of the TEAS test gets a recipe. I've never heard of someone not getting one. Half the time technical is an option, and half the time it's not. And they can really honestly do that anytime they want. So they don't ever actually have an obligation to give you the best answer to something. And so they exercise that right, I would say, a fair amount to give you the second best answer. So in the case of a recipe, I would say it is not very obvious what the second best answer is. So I'm telling you the second best answer is expository. So technical is by far the best answer. It really has no other counterpart that is a good answer at all. A recipe is not expository in any way, shape, or form. but if they don't put technical there, it's definitely expository. I've seen these questions myself a million times, and I don't miss that type of question on the teas, so I know that I don't miss it when I take it. So for whatever reason, they like to give the right answer sometimes and not give the right answer other times. The other thing I get asked about on technical, and again, there's one example that's in, I keep saying the same thing. It's either the Reading 2 or it's the Reading 3 packet. Sorry, I don't have those terribly straight in my head. One of those packets has a letter from an instructor to their students. I get asked about it a lot. It kind of starts out and says, by now you've all seen your grade, or if you haven't, you should be worried, kind of something like that. And it says something like, sometimes plans have to change. So here's some options for fixing your grade. And it's got option 1, option 2, option 3. I always get asked, why is that technical? Because the beginning of it, the first paragraph of it, doesn't come across technical. It comes across, I guess, expository. It's got a paragraph that says, by now, most of you have probably seen your grade. And if you're not worried, you probably should be. And it has that expository or possibly even persuasive type tone to it. It has a very human tone, doesn't sound technical. This is where, again, anytime you're doubting yourself or anytime you're like, why is this type? Always go back to primary purpose. So again, go find these examples. You can always pause my video right when I say something like that and go hunt down what I'm talking about so that you're right there up to speed with me. Go hunt this passage down, read the whole passage. It's a big, long thing. And tell me, what was the instructor's primary purpose? Why did they write this thing in the first place? They wrote it to give the options for fixing the grade. The options themselves, the purpose behind the whole thing, the options are technical information. So yes, he kind of led in with a little bit of something that was expository, and he kind of led out, I think, also with something that was kind of expository. Those were not his primary purpose. His primary purpose wasn't to say, you guys did bad on the test. His primary purpose wasn't to say you should be worried about your grade. His primary purpose was, here's option 1, 2, and 3 if you want to try to fix your grade. All the rest of it was secondary to that. And that can happen in any situation with any passage type anywhere where it's, there's elements of multiple things. It's mostly informative, but there's a bit of persuasive. For just a second, you're like, whoa, the author just gave their opinion. But the primary purpose, keep saying that to yourself. Anytime you're a little fuzzy, anytime you're torn between two answers, whether they're purpose answers or whether you're answering something completely different, anything in reading, honestly, keeping the primary purpose at the center of your thought process is absolutely crucial. If the primary purpose was to deliver the options, that is instructions. Instructions are technical, so the primary purpose is technical. And so down here it says, on that note, remember that any passage could have some elements from multiple types. And then this says, always, always, always go back to main purpose. What is the main style? What is the main purpose? What is the author really trying to do? There's not a whole ton of Reading 3 notes that are updated. A lot of you ask me about logical conclusion here and there. Of course, logical conclusion is ongoing practice, and there's lots of practice in this packet for logical conclusion. I won't talk much about logical conclusion right now. I will say that I expanded this right here a bit to show that what the wrong answers are, why they're wrong. Logical conclusion is all about your choices. So if you have great choices, and actually that's something that I was going to mention right here on your next page, I added a paragraph right here where I explained something. Now that you know what logical conclusions and inferences are, now that you're used to that, now that you're used to doing those, you want to start to almost acknowledge one more thing, one more specific, which is wide frame and narrow frame. You do not have to remember those terms or anything like that. You've already probably done this. So when you read a logical conclusion question, the way you answer it, and honestly how well you answer it, has a lot to do with what the choices are or aren't. If all the choices are really, really good, you might have a heck of a time getting down to that final one. The last two might be really hard to sort through. It might be really hard to get that final answer, and it might be by just a tiny little hair that one of them is better. That is what I wrote. That was what I would refer to as a narrow frame. So those are harder. And if you want to think of it as easier logical conclusion question, harder logical conclusion, that's also fine. Wide frame means that there's a lot of space between the answer choices where one of them's clearly way too far and maybe the next one's clearly stated already. And so you want to start to kind of acknowledge that. And again, don't forget, eliminate 2. And then from the other 2, you want to be really trying to think about how you can make the best possible decision. I put a list in here, and this reiterates something that we totally talked about already in class of what the steps are. And all the things that you want to look for to make sure that you're getting these in the best way that you can. This up here on the page right before this reiterates what the answer choices that are wrong, what the reasons are that they can be wrong. So they could be incorrect where they pull a detail out of the passage, but they change something about it and it makes it incorrect. They could be stated, which can be directly word for word, or it could be paraphrased a little bit, but still stated in the passage, or it could go beyond what would be an appropriate inference. On the next page after that, you'll see this thing. I kind of made like a little template. And my example is not the very best example. At some point, I will add a better example to this packet, but I have to come up with one because this is a lot easier said than it is done. This in green, though, is the target for you guys right now. So when you look at what I have in green, you can see where a perfect logical conclusion lies. It lies between the 2 ends of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum being way too far of an inference, like, you know, you walk past a kid and you don't say hi to them. And so then somebody infers that you absolutely, completely cannot stand kids and you've never met a kid in your entire life that you like. That would be so extreme and way too far. You could not infer from one quick interaction or lack thereof interaction that this is this whole person's way of being and their whole opinion and their whole state of mind. That would just be ridiculous. And then on the other end of the spectrum is when something is stated, and not only is it stated, it's stated for word. So if they actually take a detail, and you'll see I have it labeled as detail, right out of the passage and they just toss it down there, that's the far end of the spectrum on being too obvious. So this is the too obvious side over here. And then this over here is the not obvious enough side. And so I just did this to give you sort of a more visual look at what you're trying to do. Logical conclusions are balancing acts. They balance differently depending on what your choices are and how close they are. But you're somewhere between like, well, they blatantly said this, so that certainly isn't an inference, to like, oh, well, I'm just making things up as I go along over here on the really far end. In between there's kind of a half step. That's actually the really tricky one. That's where you get stuck with your extra answer choice. That's where I got stuck with my example not being all that great and me trying to like get a good example going with the little time that I had to put this together. So like over here on the end of stated, so instead of word for word, right in between the perfect answer and the totally word for word answer is like they kind of already stated it. Or another way of thinking of that is it's too obvious. It's like it's paraphrased in a way that you're not really inferring. You're not working very hard on figuring out what the author was trying to say. And then on the other end is kind of like I'm going out on a limb. Do I know that the author thinks this, or do I not know that the author thinks this? So the really far end of the spectrum is like, I am totally coming from my own opinion here, or I'm totally guessing, or I'm reading so much further into this than I really have the information to read into it. And so the half step up from that is like, well, can I assume that this is true? Or am I going too far to assume that that's true? Use this matrix with your answers. There's no way that I'm going to be able to give you examples that are as good as what you naturally come across with your questions. So my advice is to take this and have it sitting there when you're looking at answer choices. Take answer choices and look at them and say, oh, okay, so B is one of those, and C is one of these, and D is one of these, and so on. This is just to give you a visual of what the perfect logical conclusion looks like. My example, so let's say that, and here's my example written down here. So I show up to a meeting with you and I'm 10 minutes late and I say, sorry, I'm late. My dogs are being a pain today. And that's all I say. So I show up, I'm 10 minutes late, and I say to you, sorry, I am late. My dogs are being a pain today. So on the really, really stated end of the spectrum, M's dogs are being a pain today. That's pretty much word for word what I said, right? So that's definitely in the really extremely stated category. A half step up from that would be like, M's dogs are causing trouble today. So I added in the word trouble, but that's not very much of a stretch from saying being a pain. And it's not really, I didn't really go out of my way to infer that. So if you were to say to me, so what you're trying to hint at then is that your dogs are causing trouble, it would be like, yeah, obviously that's what I was hinting at. I pretty much said they were. On the other end of the spectrum, on the too far, if you were to say, oh, M has issues with her dogs daily. So based only, remember, we're always based only on what was said. Sorry, I'm late. My dogs are being a pain today. Does not give you anywhere near enough information to say, oh, she has issues with her dogs all the time. Or another example of a really extreme one would be like, oh, her dogs are so ill-behaved. They're just really, really badly behaved dogs. Those would be things that are just ridiculously too far. You're just making things up if you're making that type of conclusion. The half step would be like, M's tardiness was caused by a task she had to complete for the dogs. So that's still going a little far because it's saying like I had a task that I had to complete. And that's kind of one of those where you're like, do I know that? Do I know that there was a task? Well, no, you don't. You really don't know that there was a task that involved the dog, because it could have been more like I was sitting here and they were making a lot of noise and I didn't want to log in with my microphone when they were making noise. So you'd still be going too far here, but you wouldn't be going as far as like they're just absolutely crazy dogs. And so the middle, the one that's the best one, is that my dogs contribute to my tardiness in some way. So that's bringing together the sorry I'm late and the my dogs are being a pain today. So it's not going overly into detail about the dogs. It's not going overly into detail about like what the dogs did or where the dogs did. And it's not reiterating what I said. It's tying together what I gave you. So if I were to say to you, sorry I'm late, my dogs are being a pain today, it would be very fair for you to assume the dogs had something to do with my tardiness, because otherwise I wouldn't have said those two things together like that. So that would be your perfect logical conclusion. Again, random life examples are cool, but they're not as cool as examples that you find in your actual questions. So you can use this visual matrix, or you can use this steps system up here as you continue refining your logical conclusion. This is the last thing I want to say about logical conclusion. So if you still have two and you just cannot figure out what is what, which one is which one, there's one other thing that you can do. So imagine that I, literally me, use me as your example, that I'm the author of the passage that you're working from, and I just read the passage, my passage that I wrote, out loud to you. So if you say to me, after I read the passage out loud to you, you say, so wait, Emily, what you're saying is, and then you fill in the blank with whatever the answer choice is my response going to be, there's two possible responses. Am I going to be like, yeah, duh, I think that was obvious, or I think I was clear about that? Or is my response going to be, yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at? This doesn't have like ones that are too far, and it doesn't have ones that are like incorrect, because this assumes that you're down to the final two. And usually the final two is like one of them you're not quite sure if it's paraphrased or if it's not been said prior. So usually if you're down to two answers on a logical conclusion, one of them or both of them seems like it was maybe almost stated, or it was maybe almost too far. And so if it was maybe almost stated, this activity can help. Think about if it was my story that I read to you and you asked me, oh, is what you're trying to get at this? What would my response be? Would it be like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at? Or would it be like, I'm not trying to get at that. I said that. That was obvious. So think about this and think about your visual matrix as you keep perfecting logical conclusion. Tons of logical conclusion in this packet for your practice, and tons of logical conclusion on all of the mocks. I'm designing more mocks as we speak that have all of the real logical conclusion questions, all the situations that you'll face with those. There's a couple of passages that I want to kind of make sure that we get to in this packet so that you are perfecting some of your question answering skills. So go ahead and pause and read aromatherapy. Again, always outline your passages. For time's sake, I won't outline these passages because you are hopefully proficiently doing that by now. But I have outlined them. I do have outlines for them so that I can talk about them in the same way that I would talk about them if we had outlined them together. But from here, I want to focus on the questions for a few of these that I want to look at. So pause the video, read this passage, outline this passage, and then go ahead and answer the questions. And I will point out things with the way that the questions are answered. So I'll do a verbal outline real quick. The intro is saying a lot of people like aromatherapy and think that it actually helps with a lot of things. However, a study was recently performed that seems to suggest that they may not have an effect. And so you can tell from the intro paragraph that they're saying a recent study does not prove anything about there being a medical benefit to aromatherapy. So you can see that that's where that's headed right from the time that you're in the intro paragraph. The second paragraph is focused on how, and that's a very important thing when we talk about a study. This is how they did the study. Very important. You can't talk about a study and not talk about how it was done. So this is in sequence. It's like first they did this, then they did that, then they did that. It also happens to contain the results. So that's actually a jam-packed paragraph. The third paragraph just essentially says more info would be needed. In the meantime, certainly it's not causing you any harm if you're using them. It's just that this particular study, so it kind of backs up and says, well, this is just one study and, you know, more information would be needed. And certainly it's not hurting anything. And it's just kind of backing up and making sure that it has a neutral stance and saying, this is just one study. We just described one study and that's it. Question 1. So if you haven't done the questions, do go ahead and do the questions. I'm just going to do the questions for a lot of these so that I can look at the answer choices with you, because I wrote a lot of these to look like certain things that I want you to see. So what is the main idea of this passage? So this one should be, and actually I have a key here and I'm going to pull it just so that I can answer these really fast. I like to start with the right answer and then the second best answer for the sake of explaining these fast. So on number 1, what is the main idea of this passage? Is a recent study. Study is key. So a recent study does not show medical benefits to use of aromatherapy. So it doesn't say a recent study proves it's bad, and it doesn't say a recent study proves it doesn't help. So you want to be really careful with using conservative wording, because this particular author was careful with saying one study doesn't show a medical benefit. Doesn't say it proved against, just says doesn't show it. We didn't see a result. B is obviously too extreme on this one. Aromatherapy does not have medical benefits. And, you know, that could have been kind of easy to pick, because ultimately that is the bigger overarching direction that would head. But remember, first of all, that this is about the study. So the study is in the main idea. The study is part of the main idea, so it's got to be in your answer for main idea. And then secondly, to say it does not have medical benefits is too extreme. What we can say is this study doesn't make it look like it does. But this one is saying that we're absolutely 100% certain that there are no benefits, and that is obviously too extreme. Which of the following is the passage type demonstrated here? So that would be informative. This could have also been expository, and those will always be interchangeable, so I won't say that every time. Which of the following most closely aligns with the author's purpose in writing this passage? By the way, I mentioned something much earlier in class, and I'm not doing it because I do it automatically. When you read the question, you should read the whole question. Obviously, you read questions to yourself much faster than I read them out loud, which is why I'm not doing it correctly right now. But you notice that I underlined the key parts of the question. You can't do that because of the way that the test is set up on the computer. But what you would do is you would say, which of the following most closely aligns with the author's purpose in writing this passage? You would immediately turn around and read it again, and you would say, which of the following most closely aligns with the author's purpose in writing this passage? So the key words are the ones that I have underlined. So you can kind of visually underline them in your head, but it's going to be important because it's computerized to reiterate them onto your scratch paper or out loud. After you read the whole entire question with the flow of the question, emphasize the key words and get those to stand out as what you're looking for. So what most closely aligns with the author's purpose? This particular purpose question looks like, from the length of the answer choices, that we're going to explain the purpose as opposed to saying to inform. So to persuade users not to spend money on essential oils would be very extreme. This has not got a persuasive tone. To convey their opinion about the lack of effectiveness of essential oils, both of those are similar to one another, and they're both way off from the mission that we have. To explain the results of a study about the impacts of aromatherapy on health. That is a great, in fact, perfect answer. D says to tell a story about an experiment that was performed. I put that there on purpose just to show you that it's actually not that hard for them to sneak something in there that's totally awkward. So this is saying to tell a story. Don't forget that these could actually correspond to passage types as well. I get questions about that sometime, and there's not a perfect answer. The answer is kind of like both, neither. So people will say, but can you pick an answer that has a good purpose if it doesn't have the right words right here? Well, you want the right wording there. So you want it to start out with the correct tagline. But it's equally as important, if not more important, that the whole entire answer is expressing the purpose correctly. So in the case of a question like this, where you're answering the purpose as a complete sentence and you're describing the author's purpose, your biggest focus is for the whole answer to be right. Your secondary focus is this. In this case, we said that it was informative here, and this says to explain. So those are interchangeable, and that means that we did use the proper term. Had this been something like to discuss the results of a study, with the answer choices we have here, we would have had to pick that, even though discuss is not a passage type, because we need this. So it's kind of a gray area. It depends on the situation. Obviously, we always want all the stars to align. We want the purpose to be explained really, really well, and we want the tagline to be correct right up at the beginning. If both of those are not true, use your natural, instinctive way of thinking, which is going to say at least describe the purpose right, and then don't worry as much about the tagline. Question 4 says, which of the following is a logical conclusion based on the following sentence? The sentence is pulled straight from the passage, and it says, the study showed no significant improvement in participants, even those who stated previously that they were believers in aromatherapy or regular users of essential oils. This is a very, very important question. So this is one of your logical conclusions. And this, if you had a fabulous, fabulous logical conclusion in here for the passage, that wouldn't be what you would want to pick, because you want the logical conclusion that's fabulous for this right here and only this. So we want to pick the detail that explains, or the logical conclusion that explains that detail right there. So A says, people who believe in the effectiveness of essential oils are likely to lie about the results. That is going way too far in the realm of logical conclusion, because how the heck do we know that they're going to lie? So we have no evidence about people lying or being honest. People who have previously benefited from aromatherapy are more likely to benefit from it again. So again, that's too far. We don't have any information in front of us that says if you benefited from essential oils before, you're physically more likely to benefit again, and that's what they're saying there. People who have had positive experience with aromatherapy are already completely convinced that these treatments have a benefit. Again, you can't group everybody into a category like that and say that they're all completely convinced. Plus, they're saying here that they had no significant change even in people who are believers. So if it were true that they would be completely convinced, those people would have been reporting positive results. And then the last one, people who are true believers, as they quoted in aromatherapy, are more inclined to report a positive change. The reason that this sentence is there is because they're trying to say not only did people who don't care about essential oils report no change, people who do care about them also reported no change. And the reason that's worth noting is because they would be more inclined to report a positive change. There's multiple reasons why that's true, and that's why D is the best answer. Some of them might lie about it because they might want the results of the study to say that they're effective. Who knows? Some of them might think that they're more likely to benefit from it because they did before. Some of them might be truly convinced, so they might have a placebo effect that happens that convinces them that they did experience something. But D does a good job of tying all of those possibilities in by just saying if you believe in it already, it's more likely for whatever reason that you will report that it was a positive change. Which of the following is the primary text structure exemplified in the second paragraph? So going back up to the second paragraph, that's this one here. And so you already have this answered. And hopefully you have that answered as sequence. So that was the how, and they did it as first, second, and last. This part is the crucial part there because the sequence of the second paragraph is not the same as the sequence of the entire passage. Which of the following describes the author's motive in structuring the final paragraph? Author's motive is like author's purpose, except this is getting really specific in saying how they structured the final paragraph. This is not one of those questions that you glance at and you're like, oh, I know how to answer this. This is a question that you read the question and you're like, I don't know. You got to read your answers to even figure out what they're talking about, much less pick an answer. So this is going to be based on what they give you as an option. So you remember that the last paragraph said this is one test. It doesn't prove anything. And in the meantime, there's certainly no harm in continuing to use them, but more studies should be done to really validate or invalidate this. So let's look for an answer that seems like why the author would do that. A says to solidify the informative passage style by reiterating that this is just one test and much more data would be needed to really say aromatherapy is ineffective as a medical treatment. That will wind up being your answer. B is to convince readers that these results are accurate. That is most definitely not the way that that last paragraph was structured. It didn't say that the results were or were not accurate. It just said this is only one set. To persuade readers not to believe the results of the study, it definitely did not go that far in clarifying that this is just one study. And then to convince readers that they should keep using them until more studies are done. That was also not something that was said. 7 says, which of the following is the best detail to support the idea that essential oils may not have a measurable medical benefit? Remember, best detail is where we're trying to support a very specific and particular thing. And the best detail is going to be the one that most immediately, most directly proves that exact thing. So there's all kinds of details that might be nearby something, but the best detail to support a particular idea will be the one that actually answers that idea. So if you and I are in conversation and you say to me, essential oils may not have a measurable medical benefit, what is the next thing you're going to say to me right after that? So let's say you say to me, essential oils may not have a measurable medical benefit. And I say, what? How do you figure that? What is the next thing you're going to say? So what is the detail that supports this exact idea? This one will end up being D. The measurements showed no significant improvement in participants, even those who stated previously that they were believers in aromatherapy or regular users of essential oils. This is also, best detail is also heavily dependent on what your choices are. So let's look at our other ones. A said to find out if aromatherapy actually works, the researchers ran tests on 2 of the most popular scents, lemon and lavender. That is certainly related. It's setting up the fact there's an experiment, and the fact that there's an experiment is important to the fact that we have this answer. But that does not make it a direct detail for that. B says, first, participants in the test had their vital signs, stress hormones, and immune function measured and noted. This was prior to the experiment, so this does not show anything about whether there's been a benefit or not, so it's too early in the experiment. Next, they were subjected to stressors, and so you have the same problem there where these two things are while we're in progress. They don't say that there was or was not a benefit. They're just showing the process of being about to figure out whether or not there was one. Let me see what the questions are for this one. I want to make sure we use the ones. Okay, so the next one over acupuncture, read that one, do your outlining. And then we'll do the questions for that one real quick, and then I will skip ahead a bit to a couple of others that are coming up a little bit later. And from there, you'll be able to do the rest of this stuff on your own to practice your skills. So go ahead and read this passage, outline your passage. I will outline it very, very quickly in just a second, and we will do the questions. So from the intro paragraph, the main idea that you got was, if a recent study from Germany is valid, relieving menstrual pain could be added to a list of acupuncture benefits. So this would be hard to fit over here, but essentially acupuncture may be a method of relief for menstrual cramps or menstrual symptoms, I think is what they say. Menstrual pain. So acupuncture for menstrual pain seems to be the upcoming main idea. The second paragraph talks about the typical treatment, like the most common treatment to begin with, which would be NSAIDs, and then kind of introduces acupuncture, does a little bit of a comparison contrast. So it says typically NSAIDs are what people use to deal with menstrual pain. They have some long-term effects. That's not good. In comes acupuncture. The only effects of acupuncture is this and that. So that might be a better long-term solution. So this is kind of comparing those two. And then acupuncture is, well, there's kind of two pieces to this. So one of them is the fact that it's been studied in a lot of different settings. So it's been studied for a lot of different pain settings. That's kind of how they brought that in. Then they got into the study specifics for this particular study. So they said there's been a lot of studies over acupuncture. It's helped with a lot of types of pain. And then they went into, here's how we figured out this menstrual pain thing. Here's how we know this, and described the how. And again, you always have a how if you have an experiment. Question 1 says, which of the following best describes the topic of the passage above? Typically, when we do topic, we use a word, maybe 2 words. You can see that these are short, but they're not super short. So you might be somewhere between a topic and a main idea. It will depend on what you have as choices here. So you have acupuncture and menstruation, acupuncture's uses as an alternative medicine, studies over acupuncture and comparison of NSAIDs versus acupuncture. So a couple of comments that I have. If they asked you for the topic of the second paragraph, D would be a great answer. But they asked you for the topic of the passage, so D is just a part of it, and we don't want a part of it. Studies over acupuncture is too general. So yeah, this is about a study over acupuncture, and it happens to reference others, but that's not the same thing. Acupuncture's uses as an internal medicine, this would say that the whole topic is all the different uses of acupuncture. This is not all the different uses of acupuncture. This is very specifically focused on one thing. This is a very typical set of answer choices. Something that seems fairly close, but it's too big and we need to focus it more. So that's the difference between A and B in this case. And then something that's too small, like D, where it's zoned into just a part of it. 2 says, which of the following best states the main focus of the passage? Main focus is very similar to main idea, kind of sits somewhere in the realm of main idea, main purpose, and so on. So acupuncture may be an effective treatment for menstrual pain in many women. That's going to be the one. It says may be effective treatment for menstrual pain in many women. So we always want to be neutral with our wording on all those types of things. We don't want to say every woman. We don't want to say just women in general, but forget the menstrual pain part of it because that's key. And we want to say it may be an effective treatment, not it is or it always is an effective treatment. B says it is an effective treatment for medical ailments, including menstruation. So the problem with this one of the problems with this one is the word is does not leave any gray area. So we can't say acupuncture is effective. We have to say it can be effective. It is effective for some people. And then this says that the main focus is medical ailments and that menstruation is included. We want to be focused almost entirely on menstrual pain. Acupuncture should be used as the healthier alternative to NSAIDs in menstrual pain sufferers. This would be if it was an opinion piece about the fact that you should be doing acupuncture for this, and that's not what it was. And then D says types of treatments available for menstrual pain. This would be if the whole passage focused on talking about all the options for treatment. It is true that they discussed 2 of them, but keep in mind, again, always when you're lost, purpose. Why did they mention NSAIDs in this article? Because they wanted to, they're talking about acupuncture for menstrual treatment. They wanted to contrast that with what was used prior to it and the fact that the acupuncture is a much better alternative than that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have said anything about NSAIDs. So they're not focused on types of treatments in any way. They are totally focused on acupuncture for menstrual pain. 3 says, which of the following best states the main focus of the second paragraph? So now we're just talking about the focus of the second paragraph. So 3 is going to wind up being D, which is to explain the most common current treatment. So NSAIDs is the most common current treatment for menstrual pain, and introduce acupuncture as a safer alternative for the same ailment. This is a perfect answer choice. There could have been a situation where you didn't get something that good, but if you had to describe how they laid out that second paragraph, that is exactly how they laid that out. So they were saying, here's what used to be the treatment, or here's the common treatment, which is NSAIDs. It has long-term effects and it has side effects. Acupuncture doesn't, which is where the safer alternative thing comes from for the same ailment. So that is a perfect answer. The other choices, I'll go up from here since we're at D. C was to explain how acupuncture is performed. They definitely didn't do that. To introduce acupuncture as a pain treatment is too general. They did not introduce it as a pain treatment. They focused on comparing it to NSAIDs. And then to describe NSAIDs as a popular and effective treatment for all menstrual symptoms. Again, that would only be just 1 sentence worth of it. That would not be the second paragraph's focus. 4, which is a logical conclusion based on the passage. So logical conclusion always depends on the frame of our answers. In this particular case, C is our best answer. NSAIDs have longer term side effects than acupuncture. Where we get that idea is they talked about NSAIDs having long-term effects, and then they talked about acupuncture and they said the only effects acupuncture has is a sticking feeling when it's actually happening and maybe a little soreness for a very short time afterwards. So both of those things are gone almost immediately. And then they mention long-term, specifically when they're talking about NSAIDs. They say that there are long-term effects to NSAIDs. Looking at the other answers for this one, A said Acupuncture is a more popular treatment method than NSAIDs for menstrual pain. First of all, we do not have any information about popularity at all. If we did, I would guess that since they're kind of seemingly introducing it as like acupuncture is a new treatment, I would assume NSAIDs is probably still more popular, but that is me going way out on a limb to assume that because they did not talk about prevalence or what's a popular treatment or not. Scientists have studied acupuncture for longer than NSAIDs. Again, they really hinted at the fact NSAIDs have been around and in use forever, and acupuncture is quite new in the way they're addressing it. So that is also kind of an incorrect. This is what you would call incorrect. A is what you would call too far. And then D says, acupuncture patients may experience a mild sensation when the needle is inserted. That was stated word for word as a detail in the paragraph about the effects. 5 says, which of the following is a logical conclusion from this particular statement? So another logical conclusion, only a logical conclusion from acupuncture has proven helpful with a number of forms of pain. So what can we infer from acupuncture has proven helpful with a number of forms of pain? So acupuncture has been completely effective against pain for most people. Hopefully you recognize that as being pretty extreme. Acupuncture has had hundreds of clinical trials to test for effects with pain. At a first glance, that might have seemed good, but we have no evidence that hundreds would be the right number to use at all whatsoever. We have no idea if it's hundreds, thousands, we have no idea. Patients with chronic, so that would be too far, and actually I shouldn't have labeled A extreme, I should have labeled it too far. So both of those go beyond the information that we really have in front of us. Patients with chronic pain often use acupuncture along with other methods to relieve pain. There was no discussion of anything except the central topic of menstruation as related to this. So we have no idea what chronic pain sufferers do and what they might combine this with. So that is way too far as well. All 3 of those are too far. 5 will be answered D. Acupuncture has been specifically tested with different forms of pain, and positive results have been documented. So from them saying acupuncture has proven helpful with a number of forms of pain, we have to assume they have somehow proven it in more than one situation with more than one type of pain. So positive results had to have been documented with different forms of pain, and they had to have specifically tested that. So it is fair to assume D is true. All the others would be too far. 6 says the following sections in the second paragraph demonstrate which of the following text structures across these statements. As many are aware, and this is a direct quote from the passage, as many are aware, NSAIDs are not the safest or most optimal treatment for pain due to side effects. Acupuncture has been found effective for many ailments and has rarely been found to have any side effects. So they're asking what text structure just this is. You can see there's this ... right in the middle. That's a connection from 2 separate things. So they kind of cut out a little bit of something that was in the middle there to bring the 2 things that we're comparing closer together. There are 2 ways that this can be answered. Of course, only one of them is actually present for you to pick, and that's problem solution. So the problem is that there are side effects. It's not an optimal treatment. There's side effects. The solution is acupuncture is also effective. That's not the best answer to this, which is also a classic thing that I've been setting you up for constantly. The best answer is really comparison and contrast, because they're saying NSAIDs are not the safest and most optimal because of side effects. On the other hand, on the contrary, acupuncture is effective and it's rarely found to have any side effects. So this is a direct contrast from one thing and its benefit, disbenefit, right to the other and its benefit, disbenefit. They would never put compare, contrast, and problem solution, because in this particular instance, and this is actually a rare instance, it is totally and completely both. That is very rare. It's very rare that something could actually be both. In this case, the best answer would be compare, contrast. The other would be problem, solution. It's definitely not cause and effect. It's not a definition, and it's not a sequence. So the only one you could have picked from what they had is that NSAIDs are the problem, and then acupuncture is the solution. 7 says, what might be reasonably inferred from this passage? So inferred is another version of the logical conclusion. All women, you always know when you see all, which we see on A and D, that it's probably not going to work. All women will eventually be doing acupuncture for mental discomfort. Obviously, that's too extreme. And then let's look at D, since it says all women. All women who menstruate have some type of symptoms associated with it. Again, too far. We do not have info for those two. Acupuncture will not work for women who have gone through menopause. At first glance, that might seem like, well, yeah, because it's for menstrual. But it says acupuncture will not work. They could have acupuncture for back pain, and it would have nothing to do with the fact that they had gone through menopause. So B is off topic, but you cannot say, oh, acupuncture won't work for you if you've gone through menopause, because acupuncture is not just a treatment for period symptoms. So C is the right one. Some women will use acupuncture to seek relief from menstrual symptoms, and some will not, which is a very neutral answer. 8 says, what can be inferred about the control group mentioned in the last paragraph of the passage? This one is going to be C, so I'll start at the top with A. A says the control group consisted of 2,000 men and 2,000 women. You would not have men in this at all. There were 2,000 women in the control group and another 2,000 in the experimental group. We do not have enough information to say that. We do not have something that says there were 2,000 here and there were 2,000 there. All it says is that more than, so not 2,000 women, but more than 2,000 women were part of the study. So we do not have enough info for that. C is the right one. It says the control group consisted of women who were experiencing menstrual symptoms, but were not receiving any type of treatment or medication. So there has to be menstrual symptoms for comparison, but they cannot be receiving any type of treatment, because you're comparing someone who's getting treatment with acupuncture to someone who's not getting treatment at all, and that's giving you the rate of improvement that's being seen. D says half of the control group consisted of women who were menstruating, and the other half consisted of women who were between periods. First of all, your control group would always be all one thing. Second of all, we don't have any information that says anything like that, and we wouldn't be able to draw an assumption that is that big anyway. So there is lots and lots more practice in this packet. If you're paying attention to the timestamp on my computer, it's 3 a.m. So that is it for me. Focus again into your strategies. So the main point of this class was to review your strategies, review the things you're looking for with your passage types, your purpose, review the importance of critical strategy, talk a little bit more about how to start basic with that, but add to it and expand upon it. Work on summary again. Remember that a summary is basically if you took all your paragraph outlines and put them in a nice little sentence. So practice doing summaries in that way. And you'll see lots and lots of those on the mocks. There weren't too many summaries in this packet, but there will be lots and lots of summaries on the mocks for you to practice doing that. There's also a strategy that I have mentioned a couple of times to some of you where you can kind of list. So if there's a summary that seems really close to another summary, list out the things that it says, the things that it lists about whatever it is. so that you can compare side by side and see which of the two good summaries actually summarizes the most information. You can also practice doing that. If you have specific questions after this, let me know. Finish up this packet of course, key this packet of course. Definitely critical strategy on every bit of this all the time, getting really good at it, really fast at it, keeping all of your work really clear and written out really well. Check out the back of this packet for how the scratch paper kind of works in this scenario when you are at the test. What does it look like to use your scratch paper instead of using your computer screen? And then let me know what specific questions you have, and use this overview to prepare you for reading Mock 4 and reading Mock 5. I will see you guys later.